My name's Barry Gore, and I was involved with St Helens art scene, music scene in the 1980s into the early 1990s. So the first picture that I've chosen is a picture of Dave Evans, and it was taken at the St Helens show. Dave Evans is instrumental in so much of what happened in St Helens at this time. He started at the St Helens show was very much the preserve of older people. It was very traditional. It was famous for having every year the same stalls. The army used to be attendants. And Dave came along and he organised live music concerts, which started off initially just with small local bands, but culminated, I think, in about 1992 or 93 with the Beautiful South and Barbara Dixon headlining. Dave organised the bands at the Citadel. He contacted lots of pub venues, organised bands to play at pub venues. He was instrumental in so much of what happened musically in the town. This picture is of at the Windlehurst Community Centre at the opening of one of the 3 or 4 Windlehurst festivals which we ran. One of the men in the picture on the right-hand side is Bill Tinsley. Now, Bill personally was a big influence upon me, but I think he was probably the same for a lot of people in the town at that time. He was more than just a manager of a community centre. He helped a lot of people in a lot of ways. We used to use Windlehurst as a rehearsal space. So bands used to be able to rehearse in the kind of basement of the building. We stored musical equipment which people could borrow. We had PAs, amplifiers, even guitars and things. And that was one of the days where the festival was being opened by 2 of Saints rugby players. And we borrowed a Model T Ford from St Helens Ford as well to give rides around the field to kids. Well, the picture I'm looking at now is a bird-chested man who's operating a PA desk. We used to have the Windlehurst Festival, and it became bigger and bigger each year. And it was always local bands that played. We used to get somebody come in from a pub with a beer license so we could serve alcoholic drinks. And we used to have hundreds and hundreds of people, basically, in the sunshine in July, outside the community centre, eating hot dogs, drinking beer and watching the bands play. And it became a real kind of tradition. We did it, I think we did about 4 Windlehurst festivals. And I left to go to university. And shortly after, I think we kind of it didn't carry on. And now, if you go to Windlehurst now, you won't even see the community centre because very recently they've pulled it all down, which is a real shame, I feel. This is a photograph of the actual Windlehurst Community Centre itself. It was a real hub out of town as well, in a different area of St Helens. And you can see the little metal storage box on the right behind the sign. I'm reliably assured that the company that made that box claimed they'd never had one broken into until they put one at Windlehurst Community Centre, and they sent some of their top engineers over to see how it had been broken into. Not really a great boast, but an interesting one nonetheless. As I say, that's all gone now. That whole building's gone. This shows some people dancing at the festival itself at Windlehurst. It was an opportunity for the community centre to make a little bit of money as well, but it became quite an important little gig in the summer, and people look forward to it. And it was all when you saw how many people turned out for this, just to stand in a field in the middle of the town. Really, it made you realise just how much people were involved in art and music in the town at that time. And even if they weren't directly involved, how many people were involved as spectators. It was quite something really at this time. This photograph is of one of the bands in St Helens. This band was called Big Gloria, and the keyboard player there, Mike Parker, he's been heavily involved right from the very, very beginning in music in St Helens. This photograph in particular is quite a special one really now, because the singer who's kind of on the right hand side, Terry, he passed away just before Christmas. So quite a sad photograph really, because Terry was quite an amazing individual really in lots of respects. He got his break from the music, and then he went on to go down to London, and he acted, and he was in Casualty, and he was in several music videos and different things. A really, really lovely man. This photograph shows one of the St Helens band's Mr. Strettle's piano, taken at the Dead Fly rehearsal rooms in Ravenhead. Dead Fly was, without Dead Fly, I don't think St Helens would have been the same. It was a really tatty, grotty space at the beginning, at least, and then Brian Bunn spent some money and put some hours in to make it a more pleasant environment. This band, Mr. Strettle's piano, just goes to show the kind of diversity of the town. Very, very jazzy, often compared with Lloyd Cole in terms of the vocals, but just an incredibly musical band. And you could go from one room of Dead Fly and listen to Mr. Strettle's piano playing jazz. You could go into another room and hear Poison Electric Head playing kind of psychedelic, heavy rock. It was an incredible time. There was lots of music and lots of musical styles. This photograph shows Gary Linden on the right and Ray Green on the left, and they're actually in the relaxation area, if you like, of the Dead Fly. And I think you can see that it wasn't the most comfortable place to be, but it did have a really special kind of quality about it. Those sofas, if they could talk, they could tell a few tales, I think. But whilst it was an uncomfortable and a cold place to be, some amazing stuff went on there. This photograph shows Ray Green and Stu Rayner with Chris Lay in the middle. And Chris Lay, he became a record producer for this particular band in St Helens. Chris Lay was the bass player, or had been the bass player in the Icicle Works, who'd toured the world, done TV appearances on the Tube, Top of the Pops, All Go Whistle Test, played all over the place. But it showed how the music in St Helens was attracting a kind of greater appeal. I remember ringing Chris. I saw his telephone number in the magazine, and he was looking for bands to work with in the Merseyside area. And I rang him and spoke, and he was interested in the demo tape, and he came to listen to us rehearse and watch us play. And then he took us on and worked with us quite a lot. Stu Rayner went on to be a very successful photographer in the town. This is the man who discovered Coldplay. Prior to discovering Coldplay and producing their first two albums, he was the studio engineer, and he worked with the band I played in, that man, with Chris Lay, and he worked to engineer the recordings that we did for an EP single release in around 1990, I think it was. He was a very quiet, unassuming man, but I found out later that he'd gone on, had discovered Coldplay, demoed them, and gotten signed to a major label. And obviously Coldplay are, whatever you might think of the music, they are one of the biggest bands in the world. So I think, again, it shows the influence of St Helens was really getting to be known, and people from Liverpool, people were from the big city, were coming to see us rather than us having to play catch up with them. This photograph shows the Royal Alfred. It was a hugely popular venue on Thursdays for indie music night. In Thursdays, there would literally be hundreds and hundreds of people crammed into that pub, to the point where they would spill out onto the road outside, and people would be sitting, dozens and dozens of people sitting outside, drinking at the time Newcastle Brown, which was the kind of very, very popular drink. It was such a badge of honour to be able to play in the Royal Alfred. It didn't pay much money for bands that played there. I think when I played, we got £30, so it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a really prestigious gig. And I saw bands there that must have spent hundreds of pounds on equipment hire, but wanted to play the venue, even though they didn't make any money from it, because it was a prestigious gig. Just an amazing place. I had some great nights in there, played in there several times, and it was always just fantastic response, and really sad to see what it's become now. Just a very, very quiet, ordinary pub like any other now. This is not a great photograph, but I took this fairly recently when the Citadel closed. I know it's reopened in a different kind of guise. I was there when it opened, I think it was 87, and the government minister came in, and there was great excitement, and obviously Roger Hill was involved, and he did a huge theatrical performance all over the town. Kids from schools were bussed all over the place, and it became a really important place to go. Huge bands played there. Dave Evans booked the Stone Roses. He had the Happy Mondays there. Lloyd Cole played there. You lose track. The sound was awful originally at the Citadel, but it didn't seem to deter bands. And it was a great place to play. Just exciting to have something like that on your doorstep, really. This photograph shows Will Sargent on the left and Ian McCulloch singing. And obviously they're from Echo and the Bunnymen. But this was the first band that they formed after the first split, which was called Electrofiction. And this was the very, very first gig they ever played. And they played in St Helens. And it was just, of all the places they could have played, and obviously they're from Liverpool originally, all the places in Liverpool they could have played, they came and played at the Citadel. That's their first gig with this band, which I think kind of showed the draw the place had in its peak. This is a really poor photograph. However, it shows the band My Bloody Valentine, who are one of the most kind of seminal influences on indie music, I suppose, or any band at all. And what I think is interesting about this, when they played, not only were they a huge band, not only did they become massively influential to dozens of bands after them, but the sound that night was done by Gary Linden. And Gary was just one of us. He played bass in the band I played in, but he was involved in sound, and he liked working in PA systems and sound. And he actually got the opportunity to sound engineer that night for, potentially one of the most important bands of the last 30 or 40 years. This photograph shows one of the many little gigs, little festival outdoor gigs that occurred, where you literally would just turn up and some kind of porter cabin construction would be there with a PA system, and bands would be booked to play. What's interesting about this photograph for me is the man dancing is St Helens legend, Joey the Punk. Everybody knows, had heard of Joey the Punk. And the band playing on the stage is the Volunteers. They went on to become the Tansads, who were more successful than the Volunteers, probably because they were a bit more mainstream. But you can see on that day, a lot of beer had been consumed, but the rain had been terrible, and consequently, nobody had come out to it. So the Volunteers are playing to a capacity crowd there of 3. That's Andy Mather on the left, and it's Darren Hull on the right, the back of his head facing us. That was Derbyshire Hill. Yeah, Derbyshire Hill's a district to town in St Helens. It's one of the rougher areas of town. This is a photograph of one of the smaller stages that was set up in the St Helens show, and this is Dr. Feelgood, who were they were a legendary band in the 1970s, pub rock band from Canvey Island. Lee Brillo singing there. I don't think Wilco Johnson is in this band. I think there'd been a split before this, but they came to St Helens and played the St Helens show. And again, I think it just shows the size of some of the bands that were prepared to come here and play. And Dave was so considerate of everybody, Dave Evans, so considerate of everybody's musical taste. So you'd have indie night, you'd have a punk night, you'd have a brass band afternoon, you'd have all kinds of different musical styles. So even if you didn't like what was on Friday, you might like Sunday afternoon. He was a very good creative thinker when it came to things like that. I'd got interested in photography whilst I was at school. I'd gone into the sixth form. I only stayed for 1 year, and whilst I was there, I was told I wasn't doing enough subjects. So I chose photography because I just like the sound of it. I like black and white images, and I did get quite obsessed really with working in a dark room, and I took a camera out with me a lot of the time, as I still do now. So I took quite a lot of photographs. I probably got more than this in boxes at home. I'd have to go through them all. So yeah, I used to just take the camera with me. They weren't, sometimes people might have asked me to take a picture for something or other, but more often than not, it was just for my own personal interest really. And it was many, many years later that I kind of stumbled upon boxes of negatives and a scanner, and I started scanning them, shared them on Facebook, and people were, you know, amazed really to see their past as well. I mean, they're not great photographs technically, some of them, and some of them they need washing again, the negatives and things, but it's nice to have memories, isn't it, really, of at that time. And you know, they've become interesting because time has passed.